There we go. So I just started recording. Rob, I'll let you take it from there.
Cool, thanks. So this session is intermediate. I didn't have a good title for it, but basically it's you've seen the sort of intro to SharePoint framework. You've seen, how to use the Yeoman generator to build a project and how to run the project in the local workbench. This is sort of like, okay, well, after that, what are the other things that you need to know about? So my contact info is here on this slide, the title slide. There's my email address and my Twitter handle. There's also a link here where you can download the session materials. So it's bit.ly/WindsorSPFX. That last bit is case sensitive, so you need to capitalize the W and the S. I'll put this stuff up again at the end in case you didn't get it right now. So this is sort of the intro stuff. I'm just going to go through that to get
I don't see your screen again, Rob.
Okay.
It is coming through for me.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, I can see it.
Never mind. It's there. I had to click on it.
Switch. All right, fine. So we'll talk about web parts in this session. So again, just like basically web parts in SharePoint framework are the same as web parts have been in SharePoint since like 2007, at least at a high level, right? So it's a unit of UI you can put on a page. Users can customize it using properties. Now, instead of having server-side code to render it, it's client-side code. But from a development standpoint, it's different. From like a 10,000-foot view, it's basically the same. We also have extensions. We'll talk briefly about extensions in this session. So there's three kinds of extensions you can build. One is called an application customizer. So currently, the only thing you can do with an application customizer is add a header or a footer to modern pages. So you can see that the orange bands at the top of the page and the bottom of the page are the header and the footer. Microsoft has said, I think for the last 2 years, that they'll make other things available for to customize with application customizers, but that has not yet come to pass. There's a field customizer which enables you to modify the rendering of a column in a list view. This was introduced before JSON column formatting was introduced. So today, most likely, if you were to do this, you'd use JSON column formatting rather than going with a SPFX field customizer. But there are things you can do with a field customizer that you can't do with JSON formatting. So if you need sort of complex logic in terms of how to render your the field and list view, you might end up going with a field customizer rather than just using JSON formatting. And then the third kind of extension is the command set customizer, which enables you to add buttons into the command bar. So up here, command 1 and command 2. Or you can, you can add menu options into the list item menu, the context menu for any item. And then you can define what functionality you want to happen when the user selects a certain number of items and then chooses or clicks one of the buttons or clicks the menu option. So those are the two main kinds of projects you can build. There's a third one that was introduced maybe 2 versions ago, or last version of the SharePoint framework, which is a library component. You can think of that as like a DLL project in Visual Studio. So you're going to build a set of reusable code that you can have included in multiple SharePoint framework projects. You can achieve the same thing without using the library project if you want to build like an NPM package. So there's a couple different ways to tackle that same problem. I'm not going to talk about the library components in this particular session. So I don't want to cover that. I do want to cover this if you're not familiar with it. You can get a free Office 365 developer tenant. It's a 25 user E5 tenant. And basically, it's good for 3 months. And as long as you're using it for development purposes during those 3 months, Microsoft will extend it for another 3 months. And then if you're still using it, they'll extend it and so on and so on. So when you sign up for it, there's a little dashboard that shows you how many days are left on the current 3-month period. And they're disabled right now because of the extra load that Microsoft has on their servers. But there's also these things called sample packs where you can install the sample pack, and it will add user accounts, it will add events, it will add mail items. So if you want to use something, for example, the SharePoint REST API or the Microsoft Graph, to interact with your tenant, you'll have pre-populated data that's available for you. And again, right now the sample packs I know of are users, meetings, or events, and mail items. But I assume that Microsoft will be adding additional sample packs as time goes on. And you can install those sample packs from your developer tenant dashboard. Right, don't need that. Don't need that. Don't need that. All right, so let's talk about communicating with SharePoint. So you're building a web part, you're building an extension, you're probably at some point going to be interacting with SharePoint data. So let's go over the process you're going to use to be able to do that. All right, so I have several projects I've pre-created. So I've basically used the Yeoman generator to create a new web part project or an extension project. And let me just grab one of those. So I'll go ahead and open this up in a command window. And I'll open up Visual Studio Code. And in this particular case, I created the project using no SharePoint framework, which really means I created the project using no UI framework, right? So I didn't use React, or I didn't use Knockout. There's another generator which I don't have installed, but let me see if I can PNP SharePoint generator. Yeah, so there's the main generator you can get from Microsoft, which is the one that's, if you go to like how to set up your tenant, or sorry, how to set up your developer environment and so on, that's the one you'll get. And if you want to use different UI frameworks, then you can use this one, which is from the PNP team. It's open source, where you can do things like use handlebars or Vue or or Angular Elements. So it supports additional UI frameworks, right? So it's up to you whether you want to go with the sort of quote unquote standard one from Microsoft, the generator, or this PNP generator, really depending on, sort of what flavor of UI framework you like. So I am just going to go with, in this case, no SharePoint, no UI framework. This markup's a little bit just screwed up. The current generator, which is SharePoint Framework 1.10, it kind of messes up that markup. So I'll just go ahead and fix that up. So here's our render method, which we can use to render out the UI for our web part in this particular when you're using no JavaScript. And if we go ahead and run this, so I'll just go ahead and save this off, and we can go over to our command window and just do gulp serve. And this is going to open up, first off, it's going to transpile the TypeScript. So this is TypeScript here into JavaScript, and it's going to bundle that up. Then it's going to start up a web host, and the web host is going to serve up the workbench, the local workbench. And once we get down to, what did I? Oh, that's right. Styles, hello world, 01. Copy and paste there. All right, so we should get through here. So once this gets down to reload, then our web part will be available to use. So it is. And now we can go over to the workbench here and we can add our web part in. And there's the visual representation of this markup here. Okay. Now, again, that's all well and good, but this is the local workbench, which means we're completely disconnected from SharePoint. So there are no lists, there is no site, right? So generally, you're going to want to use what's called the hosted workbench, which is available from any site within your tenant. If you go to the site and then add in underscore layouts /15 /workbench .aspx. This will take you to the hosted workbench, which is connected to SharePoint, right? It's in the context of whatever site you have, right? So in this case, it's that site. And because this browser is running on the same machine as the web host that's hosting up my web part from localhost, it can render it here in this browser session. So this web part is called Hello World 01. So we come down here, there's Hello World 01, right? So all these other web parts, if I was to put them on the page, they would come from SharePoint. But this one, the host is the gulp serve process here, right? So it's Node.js that's actually hosting the web part. But that means I can test it in the context of my SharePoint site. And if you're going to interact with SharePoint data, that's what you need to do. You need to run from the hosted workbench rather than from the local workbench. So one of the first things I normally do is I go grab the URL to the hosted workbench and come back into my project. If right now it's going to stop serving up, terminate the gulp serve process, come into my project here and then go to the serve JSON file in the config folder. And I'm going to change the value of the initial page property from the local workbench to my page, the hosted workbench in this specific site. So now when I run gulp serve, it's going to just automatically go into the hosted workbench page. And the only thing you need to know is, and we might get an error here. Let me just see. Sometimes you'll get an error saying that the web part isn't running yet. So all you need to do is just wait until you see it gets down to reload. So once it gets down to reload, you're good. We can come back over here, just refresh, and then go load up our web part. Okay. So that's one way to just, it's not a big deal to load the local workbench and then just close that page or ignore it and then go open up the hosted workbench. But if you're, testing, making changes, restarting the gulp serve process over and over again, just not having to go through those few extra steps is actually kind of nice. But now let's go ahead and modify our web part project to go and get the list from the current site, right? And again, the current site is this demo site right here. So I'll go ahead and close this. And the first thing we need to do is add some import statements. So let's go ahead and do that. And if you're not familiar with the import statements in TypeScript, it's basically like a using statement in C#. So all we're doing is making the editor aware of certain types that are available in certain packages. So in this case, it's the SP HTTP client, environment, and environment type. And I'm going to be working with the SharePoint REST API. So I'll create a couple of interfaces that define the shape of the data I'll be working with. Right. So, and here, let me, I don't know how well this will work on the webcast, but hopefully it'll work okay. Let me just go to do this. That should be cool. Right. So in the SharePoint REST API, when you make a request for a collection of objects, so in this case, it's the name or the lists in this current site. What you get back is an object that has a property called value, which is an array of objects that represent the things that you requested. So if it's list items, those objects represent list items. If it's list, they represent lists. If it's security groups, they represent security groups. So I've defined an interface called iListCollection, which has a property called value, which is an array of things of type iList. And in this case, the two things I care about for each list are the ID and the title. Right? So we can see this interface up here saying that anything that comes back in that array will have a property called ID, which is a number, and a property called title, which is a string. Okay, so we're making use of the strongly typed features of TypeScript in this particular case. So once I have that, I can go ahead and modify my code. So what we'll do is, first off, there's a button down here, or at least an anchor tag that acts like a button, right? So that's this Learn More button here. So what we'll do is we'll change that so that'll kick off our call to get the lists. And then we'll have a div where we'll render out the lists. Okay. So I've given the anchor tag an ID of get list button. And I've also added this div down here that has an ID of list container. So when the button gets clicked, I'll go and get the list names and I'll populate this div with their names. Okay. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is just create a method that will do that. And we'll come down here and add that method in. I'll just reformat my code, and then we'll zoom in on it. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is go get a reference to the div element that I'm going to populate with the list names. Then I'm going to construct the URL for the REST API call. So just like every other SharePoint development environment, so in the server object model, we have an SP context. In the client object model, we have client context. In the JavaScript, we have _SP context info. There is a context object in the SharePoint framework, which you can use. I should stop moving that around. Which you can use to find out context information. So in this case, we're going to get the absolute URL of the current SharePoint site, and then we're going to append _API/web/lists and add an OData filter to filter out the hidden lists. Right. So this is the URL we need to build to be able to make our REST API call. And then we'll use the SP HTTP client object. We'll specifically do a GET request. We can see that right there, that we're doing a GET. My cursor is a little bit off, but there's the GET right there, to that REST URL. Now, the SP HTTP client configurations v1, that defines a default set of like headers. So it'll define what the OData format is. So it'll have the response header set to like application JSON, and then the OData configuration. So you can override that if you want by just explicitly defining the headers, but normally you don't have to do that. If you're not familiar with promises, so this is the asynchronous calling pattern. You can actually use async and await if you want to, but I'm using the promise syntax. But basically, we're going to get back a promise object. That's the .then here. So the asynchronous process, once it's complete, the .then will run, and then that function will either tell us did the request succeed or fail. So that's the response.ok right here. And then if it did, then we can go and resolve another promise. That's the response.json to get the actual data. And then once we have the data, that's what we have here, we can go and iterate over the elements in the array from the property value to write out the names of each of the lists. Right, so this syntax, if you're not familiar with it, is a little bit funky, but once you get used to it, it's repeatable. I mean, it's the same thing over and over again. And because we've strongly typed everything, and we do get IntelliSense, right? So I can say here list dot, and it should say ID and title, right? Because I've said the things in the value property of an iList collection are all objects that have ID and title, right? So I can go ahead and use that IntelliSense here in my code. All right, so this defines the method that will get the list names and then populate the UI, but what we haven't done is actually attach the event handler to that button up here. So that's this guy right there. So let's go ahead and do that. And that looks like that's this code right down here. So let me go ahead and add that into the bottom of the render method. And I just need to put the proper type name for the web part into here. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go get a reference to the element whose ID is getList button, right? So again, that was that anchor tag. And then I'm going to listen for the click event. And when the click event fires, I'm going to go ahead and run the getList button click event handler, which is that method I just added a minute ago. Note the use of the arrow functions. So this is pretty much a general practice in TypeScript. You can still use traditional JavaScript functions, but generally you're going. It's recommended that you use arrow functions. And actually, the linter will give you warnings if you use traditional JavaScript functions rather than the arrow functions, or basically the anonymous functions, right? So at this point, I think we've got everything we need to go ahead and run this. So I'll go ahead and save. And I still have gulp serve running. So every time I save, it's going to you can think of it as a compile, but it's really transpile the TypeScript into JavaScript. And then once that's done, I can go ahead and see the results up here. In the hosted workbench, you need to explicitly refresh the page. So I'll do that. And now you can see that the text in the button went from learn more to show lists. And when I click that button, we see that it goes and grabs the names of the lists in the current site and then renders them into that div that I added into the page. All right, so so these are some of the things you just need to be aware of once you start interacting with SharePoint. Now, if I were to open up the local workbench, the web part would still try to render, but it really wouldn't work. So let's go ahead and just get out of here. And I just need to remember what the URL, one sec, let me just grab, I can't remember what the URL for the local workbench is, so let me just grab that from one of my other projects. Whoops, not there. Let's go to there and config and grab the serve. There it is right there. Whoops. Okay, let me just grab that. And come back to my config serve JSON and just replace what I had there with this and save. Right, so if I run gulp serve now, it's going to load up the local workbench.
Your port's different though, Rob.
Sorry?
Your port, it's a different port.
It redirects.
Oh, does it?
So you notice it redirected to 4321?
Interesting.
Yeah. So there's the web part. So you can see it renders, but it doesn't do anything, right? Because it's not connected. So generally what I'll do, if I'm building something that a team's going to use, is I'll just throw in some code to just say it doesn't work in the local workbench, right? So at the beginning of the render method, what I'll do is I'll query the environment here and check and see, is the environment local, which means you're running in the local workbench. If it is, I'll just say that this web part isn't designed to work in the local workbench and just bail. So I won't even try to render the web part. So let's come back. I just saved. Let's come back over here. One of the nice things about the local workbench is that it'll automatically refresh when you make a change, unlike the hosted workbench. So now you can see, and I could have made this an error message if I wanted to, or made some prettier UI. But the important thing is you just indicate to whoever's using it that you can't use it in the local workbench, so I'm not even going to try to render the web part or do whatever. All right, so I didn't see any questions in the chat. Does anybody have any questions before I move to the next bit? I will take that as no. All right. So let me stop this, and let me just set the URL again for my gulp serve to the hosted workbench. All right, so I believe the next thing I want to show you is custom property. Yep. All right. So if we take a look at this web part, it actually has a property. So you can see the text here, hello world 01. That's coming from this custom property called description. Okay. So if I change this, let's just add spaces here. Notice that it re-rendered. And because I'm only rendering the list names on the button click, they went away, right? Because basically the web part re-rendered. So this is the web part property pane is currently configured to automatically update the web parts as you make changes, right? So again, you can see as I'm making changes over here, the web part is re-rendering. Right. So you can do that. You can have it work that way if you want to. Or you can modify your web part by adding in, or basically by overriding, I can't remember if it's a method or a property, but telling the web part that you don't want to have the web part properties automatically update. You want to explicitly updating them by clicking an apply button, right? And actually, I don't have that as part of my demo, but we have time to find out. So let me go to some of the training material I have. I have all this on my local machine. So web part, I think it's the web part properties one. Yeah, this one. I think it's in here. No, that one has validation. Let me just Google it real quick. So FPFX web part property pane apply button. That's it right there. Okay, so all you need to do is just go ahead and add this into your web part, this one little bit of code here. So if I come down here and add that in, save, come over here. While I'm waiting for that, I'll just go ahead and close the property pane there. Okay, so we've gotten to reload, so I can go ahead and refresh. And now when I open up the property pane, so you notice as I'm making that change, this is not changing. And then once I click the apply button, it does. Right. So some properties, it makes sense for you to automatically update your UI as you're making the property change. Some it doesn't. Right. So it's really up to you, but it's really simple to just go ahead and override that property to change the configuration from dynamic to explicit. All right, so let's go ahead and add another property. So there's a few pieces to that. So the first thing I'll do is the properties for the web part are defined by an interface. It's this interface here. Okay, so right now, currently, we just have the one property. It's called description. Okay. I'll get to that question about TDD a little bit later on. So we want to add a new property called color, which is a string. So we'll go ahead and add that in there first. And the next thing we want to do is just update one of the UI elements. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick a color, and we're going to change the background color of the web part based on that. And it's the one with styles row. So it's that guy right there that I want to change. Okay. And then we want to go ahead and add a new property to the properties pane. So down here at the bottom of the web part, we have the property pane configuration. And here there is a header. So again, if we take a look over here, there's the header, right? We have a description in there, and there's the description. Then we have a group, right? So there's the group there. And then we have the field for the description, and that's this guy right there, okay? You don't have to have all these things. You don't have to have a header. You don't have to group stuff. It's up to you. Or sorry, have the group header and that kind of stuff. But the important thing is that this is the controls that you're going to add. So there are some predefined controls in the SharePoint framework itself, and this is one of them. So a property pane dropdown. Now I've got a squiggly here because the editor is not familiar with this type name. So what I just need to go adjust my imports. So at the top here, all right, I need to update this to add the property pane dropdown. And once I do that, the squiggly will go away. But basically what this says is in the property pane, I want to add a drop-down for color. Now, you notice here it's using this strings object. This is for internationalization or multiple language support, right? I'm just hard coding the strings. You can go either way. It's really up to you. If you think you're going to need to support multiple languages, then using this technique is preferred. If it's just a single language, then you can go ahead and just hard code the strings. But you can see over here in the LOC folder is where you'd put the different language strings if you want to support multiple languages. All right, so once I have that, the last thing I need to do is define a default value for my property. So let's just go ahead and do that. So in where the same place where the web part is, same folder where the web part is, there's a manifest file. And part of this manifest is the default values for the properties. That's this bit right here. So I can just go ahead and set the default value to blue. All right. Now, when you modify a configuration file, a JSON file generally, and you know the gulp serve process is just monitoring the changes you make. If you change a TypeScript file or a CSS file or a static image, that kind of stuff, then it will recompile and reload, and you can go ahead and just refresh your web part in the workbench. But if you're modifying a configuration file, that won't work. You have to actually stop serving up the web part and then reload it. So since I've made a change here, I'm going to stop serving that. Also, for the default property value, if the web part is already loaded on the page, it will not pick up the default value. So I'm just going to go ahead and click the discard option over here in the command bar to clean my workbench. So that deletes the web part and just cleans it all up. And now I'll go ahead and do a gulp serve again. And again, just remember we need to wait for the reload to get, we need to get to the reload task. There we go. So now I can go ahead and re-add my web part to the, oh, sorry, I need to refresh the workbench. And now I can add my web part to the page again. So now you can see the background is blue, and you can see I have this new property here, which is defaulted to blue. I can change that to green and apply that, or I can change it to red and apply that, and now the background color for my web part changes. So there are several property pane controls that are part of the SharePoint framework. So if I come back over here and go up to the top again, you can see there's a text field, there's a drop down, there is a button, checkbox, choice group. I'm not exactly sure. Oh, that's probably like radio buttons. I'm not sure what dynamic field is, and so on, right? So there's a few different options. They're the general stuff you'd use, but they're not, it's not extensive. And so there's a couple other options which are a little bit too time consuming to get into in this particular session, but I do want to make you aware of them, right? So one is to use the P&P property pane controls. So if you search for P&P property pane controls, you can see them here. So this is a NuGet not a NuGet package, an NPM package which you can add to your project, which will make additional controls available for you. And these are, because it's a P&P team, community contributions are included in this, but it is managed by Microsoft, right? So Microsoft will be the ultimate decision maker on what stuff gets put into these controls, right? So we have color picker, date time picker, list picker, people picker, spin button. You can see there's a bunch of them, right? So these are all property pane controls that you can add into your project and use in addition to the native controls that come with the SharePoint framework. These controls are built using React, but you don't have to, like when I built this web part, you can still say no JavaScript framework, and the property pane controls will still work just fine, even if you didn't choose to use the React UI UI framework when you built your web part. Okay. Now there are additional controls. This is sort of a little bit outside the scope of, well, no, it's part of the conversation. So P&P, I guess SPFX controls, maybe React. Yeah, there, React. So these are controls that are meant to be used in your web part rather than in the property pane. Okay. Now in this case, your web part would have needed to have been created using React, right? So if I create a web part and choose no JavaScript framework or choose Knockout, then these will not work, right? So the property pane controls will work regardless of whether you chose React when you created your web part. The controls that go onto your web part the web part has to use React, right? So that's just something to be aware of. But there's a bunch of different controls. You can see them all here that you can use in the web part UI itself, as long as you're using React. All right, so I see some questions here. Dynamic property pane help to populate with values from a data source. So are you saying like you want a drop down that's populated from a SharePoint list? Is that what
Yeah, I'm Sanjeev here. You just mentioned that dynamic property panel. You don't know, but I just put it the note like dynamic property how to populate data source from external like SharePoint list, any other external data source you can populate there. Like the example you added the color red, blue, which is hard coded in a code, but you can populate dynamically from external data source.
Yeah, so you can absolutely do that.
Yeah, that's
so
where dynamic comes in.
So was that a question or was that just a comment?
It was a comment, like you said. You don't.
Okay.
But the question is before that there was a question on TDD. Like I have done a lot of TDD work in a classic SharePoint, and I've been moved into this SPFX. But I was thinking, like, based on your experience, like how effective or value is to invest in TDD in SPFX? Have you seen the work? The company is ready to pay. Like most of the time, company is not ready to pay. The client is not ready to pay. They say, "Oh, no, just do it quick and easy way," and we lose the real value of TDD.
So those are two different questions. So can you build web parts that are testable? Yes. Are there testing frameworks you can use? Yes. Are there automated build processes that you can use to do your tests? And yes. So the from a technical standpoint, you can do that. Now, from our customers willing to pay for stuff standpoint, I mean, that really depends on the customer, right? So there are some customers who understand, especially larger customers who understand the value of that stuff in larger, more complex projects. But yeah, I know there's lots of, particularly the small and medium-sized businesses that just would prefer quick and dirty. Quite often they end up paying for that choice, but they don't seem to change their views on those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's what I've been struggling a lot.
Yeah, so I mean, I would suggest that rather than like push or trying to talk to the customer about like TD&D and that kind of stuff, is you just start building tests. And maybe they're manually run or whatever, but you have some tests in your code. And just introduce it gradually, where it's not sort of a focus of the project. Or, you pick the stuff that is probably the most fragile stuff that when you want to refactor that you want to make sure you have tests around. So there's no real right answer or wrong answer. It's all dependent on the engagement and the client and what's the complexity of the code that you're building. So
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
From a technical aspect, it's possible. That's the important thing.
Okay. Thank you.
I didn't want to mute myself. I'm just so used to doing that in meetings. All right, so that's properties. Any other questions on properties? I didn't see anything else. Anybody else have any questions on properties? I've pointed this a couple times, but I do want to just mention it. So in Microsoft Learn, there is a learning path that has a bunch of different modules. And one of them specifically talks about properties. Sorry, can you mute? You unmuted, I think it's Sanju. Can you mute, please? All right, so where is it here? Components, to production, content. Oh, property panes right here. Okay, so this module talks about sort of a little bit of what I've shown you. So working with the out-of-the-box properties using the PNP properties, but also how to build a custom property pane field. It's not a trivial process. There's a bunch of pieces to it. But if you need to, if there isn't a PNP control and if there isn't a native control, you can build your own custom property pane control. So there's some information on this. There's a whole lab that walks you through the process in the Enable SharePoint Framework Web Part configuration with property panes that shows you how to build your own custom control. Have I played with connected web parts? I have not, Peter. At least not in SharePoint Framework. I've done that a bunch in the classic web parts, but not in SharePoint Framework. From a high-level view, it's the same process, right? So the web part, there's a provider and a consumer, and the web part says it's a provider, and then other things can consume, or the other way around. There's something else you want to consume from, and then the web part can do that. But no, I haven't had a chance to dig into that in any kind of detail. All right, so let's talk about an application customizer project. So let's come back over here and go to this folder, open a command window, and do code dot. just close these guys up. All right, actually, let me do this. Let me create a new folder here. Do this. So let's just do the Yeoman generator. So it's yo at Microsoft/SharePoint. This is assuming you're using the quote unquote like official generator rather than the PNP one. So the first bit is the same regardless of whether you're creating a extension or a web part. So what do you want to support? You can only use extensions in SharePoint Online and SharePoint 2019. You cannot use extensions in SharePoint 2016. So we'll say SharePoint Online. We store in the current folder. Let's just say yes here and no here. So this is the important part. So you choose extension, and there's the three kind of extensions, right? So I mentioned these before. Application customizer is a header or footer in a modern page. Field customizer defines a column rendering in a list view. And list view command set is adding in menu options into the command bar or into the context menu for the list item in a list view. So this project I've created is for an application customizer. And when you create these projects, and I didn't show you, I could have gone through that, it doesn't ask you what UI framework you want to use. You can use an UI framework with these, but you have to add it in manually, right? So the generator doesn't give you the option of saying, do you want to use React or Knockout? It just creates this project here where all the rendering is done in this on init method. So we have this class which extends the base application customizer. And then there's the on init method, and that's where we do all the work. Okay, so it basically just throws up an alert box to start out with. It's not really super valuable. We want to actually show the header and footer. So let's do that. So the first thing I want to do is I want to define some styles. So I'm going to add in Office UI Fabric. So first off, let me just stop serving up here. So I'll add an NPM package. So this is the functional equivalent of adding a NuGet package in a Visual Studio project. So I'm building in some predefined code through NPM or the Node Package Manager. So it's going to install a few Node packages into my project. And while it's doing that, if you're not familiar, let's go over to one of these projects. Let's go to this guy right here. So there's this folder called Node Modules. This is where all the NPM packages live. And you can see there's a folder for each package, and there's a lot of them. So you can see all these. And then inside these folders, there are other, so depending on which it is, there can be other folders. So this is a very deep folder structure, has a lot of stuff in it. So just so you know, like every single project you create is going to be 400 megabytes-ish, right? So if you're running like on a Ultrabook or whatever where you have limited disk space, you do want to clean these things up over time because they will eat up your disk space pretty quickly. All right, so that NPM package should have finished installing. It has. So that got added in my node_modules folder. And now I can go ahead and add a new file which defines my styles. So in here, I'll go in and create a new file. And in that file, I'll add this. So this is using Sass, which is a high-level language which turns into CSS, right? So you can use, there's things like you can use these tokens here and so on. There's imports you can do. I'm not a CSS person, so I know enough to be dangerous, and I can build really, really ugly UIs really well. So thank goodness there's other people who work in the same company that I do or who are good at this stuff. But the important thing is that what will happen during the compilation process is these things will get turned into types on a class, and that's how you define the styles for your web part, or in this case, for your extension. Okay, so we'll see how that gets used. So I'll go ahead and save that and come back over here to the type for our customizer. And I need to do some imports. Oh, sorry, these two, I think I've already got one using that as in. So in this one, I need to add those two additional type names, placeholder content and placeholder name. We'll see where those are used in just a bit. And then I need to import the styles that I just created. So that can go here. And now we can go ahead and define the UI for our customizer. So when you're working with the UI in SharePoint, you don't directly modify, like you don't go and find, oh, on the page, go find this element with this class name or whatever, right? Whether you're working with the web part, right? So you can see here it's this.dom element. It gives you an object which represents the element on the page which you can then interact with, right? So, and then it figures out how to render that when the web part or the extension gets rendered. So the same thing here. So we don't have a predefined object which represents the top placeholder or the header or the bottom placeholder or the footer. So we have to create those ourselves. So that's what I've done here. Now, there are times over the lifespan, like since I've been doing SharePoint framework development, basically since it started, where changes that Microsoft makes, it doesn't have the elements on the page for the header or footer for an extension. They just go away. Now, they usually come back pretty quick, but there are times when those elements are actually not there. So what you need to do is check to see whether they're there first, and only if they are there to try to render out your extension, or you might cause the page to just fail. So we'll see that in the code here. All right, so let me zoom and then scroll up. So the first thing I'll do is go and see, is the top placeholder no? In this case, storage, not no, because the bang character's there, right? So then if it is, hold on. If not, this top, yeah, so it's checking to see whether it's null. If it is null, then we're going to go create it. Okay? So we use the placeholder provider as part of the context to try to create the top placeholder. And that's where the placeholder name was used. This is where the placeholder content was used. Those are the types I imported just a second ago. Okay. If that is still null after we try to create it, then we just bail. Okay, so we just write out a message to the console and just bail. And again, it's uncommon, but there have been times where that has been the case, as Microsoft is changing how the pages get rendered, modern pages get rendered. But once you know there is a placeholder, then you can go ahead and render out the UI for it, right? So you can see here, this is where I'm using the app and top elements that I defined in the SAS, right? So an object gets created called styles that has those properties on it, and then you use that for your class. And then what will happen is those names like app and top will get munged. So there'll be like an additional bit of additional characters added to it to guarantee uniqueness. So that if there's another style somewhere in the page called app or top, you won't have a conflict. All right. So at the top, I'm just going to write out the text, header text. And so the process is exactly the same for the bottom placeholder. If the bottom placeholder is null, then try to create it. If you still don't get it, then bail, and then just go ahead and render out. In this case, it says footer text, using the same styles I defined earlier. Okay, so let me get out of Zoom here and save. Now, unlike web parts, you can't test customizers in the workbench. You have to test them in an actual live SharePoint page. Okay, so we just need to go pick a modern page. It doesn't matter which one. In one of our tenants. Sorry, I have many tenants. Not everybody has many tenants, but somewhere. So let me just go pick a site collection and go to pages. Let's see if I have any custom pages here. Let's just go create one. So we'll create a new site page. And we'll call this page TSPUG. And I don't need to see that. And I don't need to see that. And I don't need to see that. Okay, let's go ahead and publish it. Cool. All right, so let me just go ahead and grab the URL to that page. And I'll come back over to my project, and I'll go to the serve JSON file. And I'll replace this placeholder URL with that URL to my actual page, and I'll save it. Okay. You can see there's another URL here. So this is basically serve configuration. So if you want to test in like different pages and different sites, or you want to have different property values and so on, you can have different serve configurations. So when you say gulp serve, you can say what the serve configuration name is, and it will run that with those properties rather than these properties. I'm not going to do that in this particular demo, but you can do that. So now when I go run gulp serve, it's going to go navigate to that page, and it is going to add a bunch of query string parameters, which indicates we should load in debug mode. So I'm going to get an error when I click on this, okay? And it's all because my page hasn't finished being served up yet. Okay, so it's reload, that's fine. Now I can go ahead and refresh this. Right, so it's basically saying, do you want to load the SharePoint framework JavaScript so you can debug your page? And that's what you want to do, so you can go ahead and click load debug scripts here. So now there's our header and there is our footer added to the page. Okay, and again, this is coming from the stuff that's being served up here by Node.js in my local environment. Right, so when you're testing this stuff, again, with the extensions, you can't use the workbench. You have to use an actual live SharePoint page to do that, and you just saw the process that you would go through. All right, so that's an application customizer. I'm not going to demo the other customizers, but the process is somewhat similar. There is one thing. Let's see. Peter, how much time? What time do you plan on finishing up here? So I know.
We don't have a fixed schedule. We usually run about 8 o'clock or so.
About 8 o'clock? Okay. So let's go through the deployment process. So let me just stop here. All right, so we can deploy to either the tenant app catalog. So when you create a new tenant, it doesn't by default have an app catalog, but you can go ahead and create one. So I'm pretty sure I've already done that in this tenant. So it's basically just a site collection that has some, because this is still running. I closed that. Okay, let's try that again. Okay, that's what I expected. So we can go to, if I have it, it's called App Catalog. There we go. All right, so this is the App Catalog for the tenant. We can also have a site collection app catalog. So you can use PowerShell to create this. It has to be done. The only option is use PowerShell. There's no UI you can use to create a site collection app catalog. But you've got a site collection app catalog if there is a list called apps for SharePoint in your site collection. Okay. Web parts can be deployed to a site collection app catalog, which means that web part can only be used within that site collection, unless, of course, you deploy it to other site collections or to the tenant app catalog. But if you want to scope a web part to a specific site collection or a specific set of site collections, you can deploy the package to the site collection app catalog. Extensions cannot be deployed to a site collection app catalog. They need to be deployed to the tenant app catalog. Okay. So let me come over here to my package solution JSON. So in the app catalog, this will be the name that's associated with it, right? So if we go to here, so this will be the value that shows up here, right? So generally, I don't like, the way that the names are formatted. So I'll just call this the TSPUG demo extension. And this is the name of your package. So we can leave that by default. It's up to you whether you like that naming convention. Let's just change it. So, TSPUG extension. All right, so there's a two-step process. You do a bundle and then you do a package. So I'll say here, gulp bundle, and --ship is like a release build. So without the --ship, it's a debug build. With it, it's a release build. So what this will do is it'll create a bunch of files that represent the TypeScript, the CSS, any other static files. Okay, so we should now have a folder in here. Did I do that in the right folder? Yes. Oh, there it is, temp deploy. So those two files there, right, that JSON file and that JavaScript file is what is the bundle. And then we'll create the actual package. So that's gulp package -solution --ship. And this actually creates the SPG file. So under SharePoint solution, there it is, SPPKG. Right, so this is basically an app package. While it has a different extension, it's the same format as if a package that you would create with a SharePoint hosted SharePoint hosted add-in or app or a provider hosted app. This is what goes into the app catalog. So this is this folder here. So SharePoint solution. There we go. So I just grab that URL, come over to my app catalog, go ahead and upload. Choose files, navigate to that folder, and choose this guy here. All right, so you can see here that there's this checkbox, make this solution available to all sites in your organization. So one of the questions you get asked when you run the Yeoman generator is, do you want to give the administrator the option of making your web part or extension available tenant-wide automatically? Okay. And if you say no, this checkbox won't be shown. If you say yes, then it is. And the admin who's deploying to the app catalog can then say, yes, I want to do this, or no, I don't want to do this. So I'll go ahead and check this and then click deploy. One other note, while you're doing this process, make sure your app catalog is in classic mode. If it should never happen, but for some reason it does every once in a while, the app catalog shows in the modern experience, it won't work. That dialog that I just showed you will not pop up. Your web part will not properly deploy, or your extension, your package will not properly deploy. So just be aware of that. And if you are in modern, just click and go back to classic. So we can see there is our extension, and you can see there are no errors. So that's cool. So now if I navigate to any modern page within my tenant, I should now have a header and footer, right? Because I said, just automatically make that available across my entire tenant. If I didn't do that, then what I'd have to do is go into the site collections where I wanted to use that extension and go to add an app. And then there would have been an option here to add that app to that site collection. Okay. Now, if you do this with extensions in the app catalog, there is a list called tenant-wide extensions list here. And there is the entry that makes this extension, this application customizer, available tenant-wide, right? So when I deployed the package, this list item got added into this list. It's not the same for web parts. You can have the web part deployed, available automatically, but it doesn't add in an entry into this list. Okay, so this is for extensions only. So let's say, for example, I don't want it to retract the app package, but I don't want to see the header and footer right now. I can go into this list item, select it, go to items, and choose edit item, and I can just disable it right there and click save. Okay, so now if I go back to another page, or go back to that same page I was before, you can see I don't see the header and footer, right? So that's up to you whether you want to deploy per site collection or tenant-wide. If you do deploy tenant-wide, you have a little bit of control over that. Something that is quite valuable for extensions like this is the properties, right? So if you want to configure how the extension works, you can use these properties, right? So if we go to our extension here, we can see that there is a property called test matches defined, right? So it has a property. Now there's no property pane like there is with web parts, but there is this custom property here. And when you're testing, what you can do is if we go up to our config and go to serve JSON, here's where you can set the value of the properties during test. Okay. So, you could have multiple properties that, so the, if you're using your app customizer in multiple tenants, then it can behave differently. Let's say, for example, you need to get data from SharePoint, a SharePoint list, but not every tenant is going to have that list in the same site collection. So you can put the URL to the site collection where the list is going to exist in there. There's other configuration you can do. So this is for testing. For deployment, it is, shoot, where is this thing in deployment? I gotta remember. Not there, it's not there. Oh, I think it is here. I think you added it into here, the properties. I think. Not positive. Shoot, it's not. No, it's not in the manifest. Yeah, you must have to add them in the package solution. Add the property values there. Now I'm debating with myself. SPFX extension extension, deploy properties, deploy your extension to SharePoint. Oh, no, it's in here. So if we go to the SharePoint, there's an assets folder. It's here. So this is where you define the custom properties. Okay. Custom property values. So this would be something that would get deployed out. And the nice thing, if you do deploy tenant-wide, is you can go into here and edit those property values. Okay. So you can edit the property values just by editing this item. So you can go into items, select the item, and then edit item, and then you can go and modify the properties here. Okay. If you deploy site collection by if you choose not to deploy tenant-wide, so you're doing site collection by site collection, then you actually have to go in and make changes here, redeploy your web part and update redeploy your extension package, and then update the extension in the site collection. So it's a little bit more clunky. Actually, it's quite a bit more clunky in that case. But as I mentioned, for application customizers, these properties are super, super valuable. So it's just something to be aware of. All right, so any questions on extensions at all? Someone opened their mic, but I can't hear anything. Is that a question? Okay, I'm going to take that as no. So let's see. I don't have any more prepared content. There's lots of things I could show. Does anybody have anything? Oh, sorry, there is a question. In chat. Let me just wait for them to type out. And while that Navjot is typing that question out, are there any other topics that we'd like to cover in the last 25 minutes?
Rob, Peter here. I always love seeing real-world examples. I don't know if you can share anything, but even without diving into the code, to say, here's some cool things that I've done and what's the scenario around it.
Yeah, so first off, the Navjot's question, can they be deployed to a site? Extensions can't. Extensions have to be deployed to the tenant app catalog. Web parts can be deployed by to the site collection app catalog, but extensions can't. Now, you can deploy the extension to the tenant app catalog, but only add it to specific site collections. But in terms of deployment, no, it has to be deployed to the tenant app catalog. Event receivers. So you're talking about, Aaron, can you just, is that like Microsoft Graph event webhooks, or is that, I need more context there. Navjot, I'm not sure exactly what the technical reason why you can't deploy extensions to the site collection app catalog. Peter, so while we're waiting for the, okay, so like when an item gets added to the list, you want something to kick off. This is Aaron's question. So there are, SharePoint has certain webhooks. So let's Google this. SharePoint webhooks. So there are things you can do to get webhooks. So what you're going to do is you're going to register a web service with SharePoint for a specific event type. And not everything has webhooks, right? So certain things, I'm almost positive list items being added or changed are all event types right there. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted. Can't remember there's a resource somewhere that says what specific things have webhooks and what don't within SharePoint. But again, what you're going to do is you're going to build a web service that you'll register with SharePoint to say when this event happens, notify me. You'll get notification that, like, for example, the items in this list changed, right? And then you need to go back and do a request to find out exactly what changed, and then you can go ahead and run code to handle that, right? So that's the way you would do it within, if you wanted to use SharePoint webhooks. The other option you can use is something like Microsoft Flow, right? So you can use Microsoft Flow to run when an item gets added or changed or something like that. So really, depending on the complexity of the functionality you want to happen, it might be a lot easier to use Flow than it would be to use a webhook, right? But then there's limitations on what you can do in Flow. Not everybody knows Flow, and then you might get into licensing issues too, because there's a lot of stuff that's premium in Flow. So, but yes, you can in SharePoint. There's also Microsoft Graph webhooks that you can use. The high-level process is exactly the same, where you create a web service, you register that web service with the Microsoft Graph. It notifies you that the event happened. You go back and ask the Graph, okay, what exactly happened? You get the details and you process it. One thing you need to be aware of in both cases is the webhook registrations they have a lifespan. I haven't checked it recently, but in the Graph, it was very short. I think it was like 3 days. So you need to be cognizant of that and re-register your webhook before it expires, or it will stop working correctly. I can't remember what the expiration policy is in SharePoint, but I know it's a lot, or at least it was last time I looked, quite a bit longer than it was in the Microsoft Graph. Is there a way to build a query string parameter web part like a classic to filter modern? So yes, you can have something that navigates to a page, adds a query string. And in the SharePoint framework, you can read that query string and act on it. So yeah, the query string handling is really not that much different than would be. Oh, you're talking about like filters on list views? I think the answer is yes. I think there are still the list views, even in the modern experience, still respect the query string parameters you could do to filter the list view. But I don't have details on that. You can add webhooks using the SP Editor Chrome extension from Dennis. Thank you. Obtaining the URL query string parameters. So there's a link on that. Basic question: what is the learning path from SharePoint server-side object model to SharePoint framework? So from the server object model to SharePoint framework, I'm going to assume that you mean more than just the API itself, right? So the process of building stuff using the traditional SharePoint development model like Farm Solutions. With the SharePoint framework, it's quite a bit different, right? So you're not using Visual Studio. You're using these sort of modern web development tools. Let's see, I have a slide on this, right? But once you kind of do the mapping and go through the learning process, it's really not super different. At least, again, at a high level standpoint, there is definitely a learning curve, but it's not. When I first saw the new tool chain, I was like, oh my goodness, this is going to take forever to learn. And it actually does. It didn't for me. Right. So there's this sort of mapping of things like the .NET framework. There's stuff that the .NET framework and IXpress does that now Node does. Where you would use NuGet in a Visual Studio project, there's NPM. There's a task runner that's semi-equivalent to MS Build and so on. Right. And once you go through the learning process, like you don't have to know NPM or Gulp or even Yeoman at a deep level for most things, right? So if you go through, something like this MS learning path, you should be able to get up and running, relatively quickly. Now, there's some times that you'll, for example, you want to build a gulp task that does something custom. Well, if you don't know gulp that well, then that's going to be a little bit of a struggle at the beginning, right? But once you go through that learning, then it's not that bad to continue on. So for the base, for most stuff, you don't have to have a deep knowledge of like NPM or gulp or TypeScript. Sorry, not TypeScript you do, sorry, Yeoman. But there are times when you need to get a little bit off the beaten path, and then there's a hump again that you have to sort of get over. But it's not as daunting as it might first seem to go from Farm Solutions to SharePoint Framework. SharePoint Web. Oh, okay. So the registration for a SharePoint webhook lasts for 6 months. Thanks, Dennis. So Peter had a question that's still outstanding. Anybody else have questions?
Hi, Peter. I have one quick question. Like, I know it's not this context, but a little same context. So, coming back to the properties you showed us, one of the real challenge I have faced so far, like I haven't find the right solution, but I don't know if you have. Say you have a SPFX web part and you have deployed in a production environment, and there are like thousands of sites or pages as that web part. And now, at some point of time, the customer decided, oh, we need to change the properties of the web part. So say from the color background blue, you want to change it to the red. And so it's like it's on 1,000 pages. The one way is go manually and change the properties to red from blue, or else you write a script. So PowerShell script. So do you have any intel or anything you have done, like changing the properties using PowerShell scripts?
No, I don't.
Okay, because what I found, you can read the properties from a PowerShell. I haven't found a way to write the properties back because it comes, when you read it, it comes in a JSON format, and you maintain the same format and change the value. It doesn't work, actually. I've never found the right solution. How should we do it?
Let's just see this link that was just posted into the chat. PnP client-side web part. So you get to the page. So there's the properties JSON there. So it looks like, okay, set the properties of the client-side web. There we go. So now you'd have to do this per page, right? Per page,
yeah,
and then per web.
The page, that's not a problem. But I think, I don't know, article has been written recently, but 6 months back, this such PnP never works.
Yeah. So, like, it's funny because anytime I do one of these talks, I don't want to say it over and over again, but like, this is my current understanding, but it could have changed in the last 10 minutes, right? Like, so much stuff is changing so rapidly.
I know. Yeah.
That, okay, well, I know that it's, the stuff that's in the V 1.10 of the SharePoint framework, that won't change until there's 1.10.1 or 1.11, right? But what's in the PnP sites core CSOM, or what's in the PnP PowerShell, that's changing on a different cadence, right? What controls are in the property pane controls? Well, that's changing on a different cadence. So it's virtually impossible to keep up on all this stuff, right? Like, just as an example, this morning I was working on a developer tenant, and all of a sudden it just switched MFA on me, like magically. So I'm like, well, I went into the Office portal, right? So if you go to like office.com, the Office admin portal, so you go to admin, and I know that part of the configuration for MFA is if you just go to users and active users, there's MFA configuration here. And it's like, okay, well, was that turned on? And it's like, no. Sorry, somebody's got their mic open. Can you just... somebody's got their mic open. So that wasn't it. And then there's like, okay, well, there's something down here in settings. There's a thing. Well, that wasn't it. And it turns out it was something in the Azure portal that got changed. Just, I don't know, just magically just got changed. But like, just stuff like that happens like all the time. So keeping up with all the moving pieces is just, it's very, very difficult.
Yeah, I know. That's what these conferences are weekly. These sessions or monthly sessions are very important because somebody had done it recently and you might never know it.
Right. So on the vein of this stuff, if you're not familiar with it, the PNP team has like, or not just the PNP team anymore. SharePoint PNP community. Let's see. Where is it? Yeah, there's these community calls. So the SharePoint PNP team started them, where they have, basically it's like a user group meeting, right? But it's run by the actual PNP team. So Vesa Yuvanen and other people from Microsoft, as well as community members that are involved in it. And so they record all of them. They go up on YouTube. The Graph team has one. The Power Platform team, I think, has the same thing. I know there's one on Azure Identity. There's one on like adaptive cards. There's all these different community calls that are like, and trying to keep up with those on itself would be a full-time job. But there's lots of different, in addition to the user group community here, there's community stuff that's available for you from Microsoft too. And all this stuff gets recorded and put up on YouTube or some other platform. So Peter had a question about real world. Let me see what I can show. Unfortunately, I have like 8 billion tenants, so I just got to remember where this stuff is deployed. There's one thing I definitely can show. I just got to remember where I've put it. Okay, so let's go create a new site page here. And while that's opening up, let me just open up another one. I'll show another example in a second. So TSPUG. Employee directory. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. So this is just like an example web part that we created. So it has a couple filters for department and office, and then it shows the employee directory information. So if you want to show, like, you have a single web part where you can find all the employees in your Office 365 tenant, you can, this is an example that we've built. Example web part that's in a bunch of different tenants. One of our tenants asked for a banner to be shown at the bottom of the page. So you can see this is an application customizer where we've posted a banner at the bottom of the page. You can close that, and that'll put a cookie into their on their browser, so to not show it for the next 20 days. So you can see that we even have this, so it shows different languages depending on the user's profile information, right? What language that they have as their default. So that, again, that's an application customizer. Another client had a need for something that would do provisioning for them. Not major provisioning, but a little bit depending on. certain data within the site collection. So we use an application customizer for that as well. So the application customizer doesn't present any UI at all, right? But based on certain data within the specific site collection, it performed, would look to see whether certain things have been provisioned, or would do some validation and let the user know that there was issues. So again, we used to use an application customizer for that. So those are some real world examples of stuff we've built. There's other stuff, but it's all in client tenant, so I can't really show you, unfortunately.
No worries. That's good. Thanks, Rob.
One of the real example of app customizer is applying the branding. So if you have a client who wants to apply header footer is one thing, but apply overall CSS override or overall branding, you can use app customizer for that.
All right, so let me get started out of time here. So let me just go down to the end. I think I have a resource slide.
Yeah, hi Rob. Actually, I have one very basic question if I can ask.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, so there are certain requirements where the client is asking to migrate these sites from SharePoint on-prem to SharePoint Online. But the catch is that there are certain customized web part in the SharePoint on-premise, and we find it very, very difficult to move those customizable web part from SharePoint on-premise to SharePoint Online. So what approach we could take to simplify the entire process? What could be the holistic approach in that case?
So I'm assuming that those web parts are like classic web parts that were developed using a farm solution?
Yes, it is. Some are in the farm solution and the rest are in the client-side web part as well, which are actually built on the content editor and the script editor web part. So we find it very difficult to move them to the SharePoint Online. So what would be the possible approaches that we can look forward to?
So for the web parts that are in a farm solution, unfortunately there's no good answer to that question. You're really gonna have to look up at redeveloping them. For stuff that's built using the content editor, script editor, you have a couple different options. So one option is to take what you've got and move it into the SharePoint framework. So I've been showing you TypeScript, but you don't have to always write TypeScript in TypeScript, right? TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript, meaning that JavaScript still works. I can just write JavaScript here, even though it's in a TypeScript file. So some of that stuff you can just take and put into your SharePoint Framework web part projects. There's also hold on. So moving from content editor to SPFX. Yeah. So there's docs on this. Some examples of moving from a script editor web part to a SharePoint framework. Okay, so there's documentation. I believe there's a video on this. There's specific examples that walk through how to do this, right? So you can use this as a guide if you want to take what you've built and move it into a SharePoint framework web part. The other option is to use a third-party web part. So the only SharePoint framework web part. Okay, well, this is go here. Okay. So a gentleman named Michael Svensson, who actually now works for Microsoft, he's on the search team, created a modern script editor web part. So if you want to go that way, what you can do is take the web parts that you built for SharePoint on premises and move them up. Now, as long as those web parts aren't doing DOM manipulation, for example, let's say your web part has script in there that removes the quick nav. Well, that's not going to work, right? Because the DOM in modern pages is different. And two, you're not supposed to be modifying the DOM anyway. But if what your web part does is it just has a div that it, emits JavaScript and HTML into, HTML into, then that's fine. You can go ahead and use this technique. So Michael Svensson created a script editor web part. I took that same technology and built a content editor web part that you can download. It's available on GitHub. So that's another option you can explore. So hopefully those resources will help you. Again, you want to take a look at migrate jQuery and migrate existing script editor web part customizations. This is in the Microsoft Docs. And then the other thing you want to search for is this one here, perhaps the only SharePoint framework web part you will ever need.
Okay, just one thing out here, that the script editor can only be added in the classic SharePoint. It cannot be added in the modern web part, right? Modern site, right?
So as I mentioned, Michael Svensson created a modern script editor web part. So it's a third-party web part. You have to download and install.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it possible to copy your PowerPoint? Oh, okay. So that's an easy question to answer. So let me just come down to resources here. So the Office Developer Center, the training content, I've got this link. This link should be replaced by this link here for the MS Learn. So that stuff, the stuff that's linked here, oh shoot, I got them all over the place, was in GitHub. Actually, that link will still take you to the GitHub repos, and they'll link to the MS Learn content. So it's all free training content, a bunch of modules. If you're familiar with Andrew Connell, he has a SharePoint framework course that you can purchase. And then to answer the question that I just brought up here, this is the link here where you can download the slide deck and the demos. So it's bit.ly Windsor SPFX. That is case sensitive, so you need a capital W and capital S. If for some reason you can't get them, you can email me or tweet me, and I'll be happy to send you the link. My email address and my Twitter handle are there. All right, Peter.
For the recording itself, we don't have an official TSPUG YouTube channel. We're kind of new to all this. Do you have a preference? Do you want to put it up yourself if I provide you the recording, or do you want us to find a home for it and just let you know where to link it to?
If you want, I can host it on my YouTube channel, and then I can just send you the link, and you can send it out to the members.
Sure. So I'll send you a OneDrive link with the recording, and then you can put that up and send it back. That'd be great.
Sure, we'll do.
Well, this has been good, Rob. I want to say thanks for everybody for tuning in, and absolutely, Rob, thanks for pulling this together as a virtual session. It's a new world, but we're figuring it out. I think it went pretty smoothly once we got things rolling at the beginning there.
Yes, thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Good night.
Yeah, thanks, Rob.
You're welcome.
Thank you. It was a good session.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.